Saturday. It's May 11th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in sunny London.
And I'm Michael Haney, back in New York City after being in sunny London with sunny Ashley Baker.
Hi, reindeer.
I'm not your stalker.
Not yet. You never know. The day is young, Michael. The episode is young. No, we have a lot to talk about today. It's been a wild and wacky week in the news. We've had Stormy Daniels testifying in New York in the Trump hush money trial that seems like it's going to go on forever. We've had some movement, although probably not enough, in peace talks between Israel and Gaza. In the meantime, Michael, here in the UK, we found yet another dating con man who's scammed poor British women out of over $100,000 under the premises of a Tinder date. So, Michael, again, it's just another wild and crazy week in the news.
It is, and we've got a great show today packed with fascinating conversations with great writers. First, last week, students on the campus of Columbia University who had been protesting Israel's incursion into Gaza occupied Hamilton Hall there. After a standoff, the New York City police arrested many of them and cleared their encampment. Not many reporters were on campus that night, but Alyssa Chouanier was. She is a graduate student in journalism at Columbia, and she will join us with her report on what she saw and where things may be headed. Then, John Arledge joins us from London with a new look at an extraordinary scandal. 10 years ago, high-profile members of the British establishment, including a former prime minister, were accused of sexually abusing children. In the effort to discover the truth in what is known as the Beach Scandal, however, the country tore itself apart. It's a fascinating story, and he'll tell us more. And finally, Flora Gill always has her finger on the pulse of what's new in the culture. And then this week, she'll tell us how many people in search of physical and emotional intimacy are increasingly turning to what are known as, quote, AI compassion sites, whether they are single in real life or not. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
All right, Michael, let's start with a story that is the talk of dinner parties and editorial meetings all over the world. It is, in short, campus unrest, and it is happening at universities all over the United States and around the world to some extent. We have a student live on the ground at Columbia University. Her name is Alyssa Chouanier, and she is a journalism student at the university's School of Journalism. Welcome, Alyssa. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Alyssa, you're a student at Columbia's journalism school. What's life like for you right now?
Well, it's definitely been different in the middle of a very intensive program in the last week, and our campus has been shut down. And I'm really proud of the journalism students here who saw a void in the news cycle and stepped up in the middle of finals week and our last days here. I think it's really a testament to the future of journalism.
Are you involved at all in the protest movement, or are you covering it for the paper? What's your role been?
I have been covering it as a student journalist. I was stringing for a couple different publications. I'm not involved with the school newspaper now.
As a journalist, how do you find the organization of these protests in the encampment?
I first entered the encampment and saw that they were running their assembly like you would a city council meeting. They would pose their propositions to the entire encampment, which was several hundred people, and allow people to share their opinions on issues like how they would handle politicians who wanted to come into the encampment to campaign, and they would take a vote. And then I saw that they were receiving a lot of support from the outside. They were getting food catered in every day. Every evening, they would do a cleanup where they would ask everyone to pick up 10 pieces of trash. It was incredibly clean, though. There would just be a few scraps of paper to find.
And around how many people are involved in this right now? And is there a police presence? Just sort of take us into the nuts and bolts of it.
Right now, I am not able to be on campus, but when the police came in on April 30th, the school administration said that they would stay through May 17th, which is 2 days after our graduation. And they have barricades set up around the campus. The student journalists were on a list where we were supposed to be allowed in, but there have been some inconsistencies with how that has played out. They're starting to reopen the campus now to certain students. But there have just been barricades set up all around campus, all around Morningside Park. You have to show your ID several times just to navigate even the neighborhoods around campus.
So in your story this week for Airmail, you covered the encampments and then the police removing people who occupied Hamilton Hall. So are you graduating this spring?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you feel about the school canceling the large commencement and sort of rejiggering it so everyone has small commencements? How do you feel about it?
Well, speaking only for myself, the individual school graduations were more important to me personally. So canceling the large graduation, to me personally, I am not particularly affected by it. I think more impactful situation was not being able to get onto campus during these last weeks.
And in your story this week, you were inside the encampment before it was cleared. I'm just curious, according to what I've seen, Columbia has an enrollment of basically 9,000 undergrads. And you've seen stories about there are people in the encampments who were not necessarily students. Did you see any people who you thought were not necessarily students, but just outsiders?
I did see one, and it was an interesting moment. I think it was my first night that I was spending time in the encampment. And this would have been about a week and a half before the escalation to the occupation of Hamilton Hall. She told me that she was an alum and she had tried to get several of the students to join the outside protests, which there was a lot more tension and hostility outside the gates. She had called for a few students who wanted to join them. Only about 6 or 7 students raised their hand saying that they wanted to. They stepped a few feet outside of the encampment, and then one of the students said, "Oh, we can't actually go outside and join the protest. We don't have a consensus on this."
I'm curious, graduation is coming up. Do you get the sense from students engaged in the protest they have a plan to continue this once school is over for the semester, during the summer, or what do the next couple months hold for protesters?
I don't think that they have any intention of backing down. Right now, with the campus closed, the student protesters are now pretty well integrated with the protesters from outside the school. They've still been protesting every night.
And how about faculty? Do you see a lot of faculty joining in, or in your reporting? How do you see the faculty on this?
I have seen a lot of support for the students from faculty. I have not heard from any faculty that did not support the students.
So you've seen 100% support among faculty for it?
From what I have seen, yes.
Curious question. What kind of questions do you get from your parents?
This was actually the main reason that I wanted to report on this, because my parents, my friends' parents, all of us in the school were getting so many text messages and calls from people asking, "Are you okay? What's going on at Columbia?" And for us going to class, and me as a student who is not Jewish or Israeli and wouldn't be subject to any anti-Semitic hatred, which I know some students were experiencing that, and I don't want to invalidate that. But for me, I would just walk to class and see kids camping. It was not chaos, and it was not a crisis.
Alyssa, what do the students really want? I mean, what are the nuts and bolts specific things they're asking for? And then what do you think is kind of the bigger picture desire to come out of all of this?
The main thing that the students are calling for is divestment, for the school to cut off financial ties from supporting Israeli occupation forces.
And how are they defining that, Alyssa? Like, what determines if a fund is supporting, as you say, Israeli occupation forces?
They have called out different businesses like Caterpillar and Boeing, who down the supply chain they identified as supporting these forces. Another thing that they were calling for was transparency, because only a very small percentage of the university's financials are available to review. And they were also calling for amnesty for the students who face disciplinary actions regarding the protest.
How do you feel about amnesty for protesters?
I think it depends on what disciplinary actions they were facing. There were true anti-Semitic incidents, and they should be disciplined for that. For students who were peacefully protesting, I think that they should have their right to do that.
Where do you see this all ending, Alyssa?
Well, I think that the protest is a complicated ask. I don't think that the university is going to change their stance. I think that this will just carry on.
Alyssa, how do you think that the students on campus of Columbia are responding to all of the media coverage around them? Has it become a bit of a media circus? What does it feel like there?
Yes, it absolutely was a media circus. With the police barricades up now, it has died down quite a lot. But yes, in terms of the news coverage, a big part of the reason that I wanted to get involved was because what I was seeing on campus was not matching what a lot of the news coverage was saying, because I think that was largely because press was not able to get onto campus. If they were, it was only during 2-hour press blocks. And everything that was happening outside the gates had more tendencies toward hostility. I'm so proud of all the student journalists who stepped up here, saw that there were gaps in the news coverage, saw that they had access that no one else did. And we all really stepped up. And the journalism school was incredibly supportive.
Well, Alyssa, thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight and wishing you all the best as you continue to cover this.
Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. Well, certainly in less cerebral matters, let's get Flora Gill on here to talk about the rise of AI as it involves our love lives. This is scary just introducing her. Flora is a writer based in London and a very brave soul for even tackling this subject. Welcome, Flora.
Thanks for having me.
So, Flora, it's not bad enough that AI is going to take our jobs. Now it is also coming for our love life. And you have delved into this territory for this week's issue. What did you discover?
Yeah, I discovered that AI is very common in almost every area of dating. People are using AI to enhance their online dating profiles, to make their images look nicer, but also to start off the conversation with people, to skip that stage. And then what I really looked at, crucially, is the fact that people aren't just using AI to help them get dates, they're effectively dating AI, which opens up a whole new can of worms with what is and isn't cheating and what is and isn't acceptable if you're in a relationship.
Let's start first with the use of AI to get dates. I mean, this goes beyond just manipulation of photos, right? Take us through it.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of different apps, different extensions. Some people, as you said, are using them to just enhance photos, but I say just enhance, you can enhance them a lot and effectively catfish someone, which most people think it is catfishing if you go to the extreme end of making yourself look almost like a different person. And then there are also extensions that will sift through all of your matches and will start having the initial conversations. I was reading about a woman recently who went on a date where she thought she'd bonded really well with the man. It had a lot of banter, a lot of quick conversation. And then she met him and he was completely different. And she felt she didn't really understand what had happened, and then slowly realized that she had actually been talking to AI and the man she was talking to didn't exist. This was a different person.
I mean, are people who are using AI to get dates in this way, are they operating from a place of desperation, of a lack of confidence about their own social skills? I mean, because it seems like this is something that would come up fairly obviously within 30 seconds of meeting someone, right? If they're dramatically different from the AI personality that they were using in these early digital conversations.
Yeah, you would think so. I think people have got slight fatigue with online dating and app dating. So people are trying to find any way to skip past it is one thing I think a lot of people are dealing with. There are also people that have met their other halves by supposedly doing this first. There was a software developer that recently spoke about how he'd met his soulmate after using all these algorithms to sift through it. I think there are lots of people doing it for lots of different reasons, some malicious and some not.
Flora, it doesn't seem all that long ago that Spike Jonze's film Her came out. I mean, that was in 2013. And the film was based on this notion that the protagonist, Joaquin Phoenix, falls in love with a voice on the other end of his phone. Turns out, fast forward 11 years, that stuff is really happening. So what is going on? Are people actually getting into relationships with computers?
Yeah, people definitely are. And it's a real thing. And people are becoming very emotionally attached. I think Replica is a really good example. At one point last year, they pulled back the sexual appetite of their companions that people were in relationships with. And immediately that showed and displayed how connected people were to these non-corporeal figures, because the reaction was really extreme. People having suicidal thoughts, people saying they felt like the loves of their lives had been lobotomized. And I think that displayed that people aren't just treating these as just something fun or just even something sexual. People are forming real emotional connections. And a lot of people referenced the Her movie, as you said, when that happened.
Well, Flora, one of the things is there's other sites. I guess for people who've never been on them, including myself, these are not just digital things. They're actually, I mean, in a way, you reference Her, which had, I want to remind us all, Scarlett Johansson voicing that, which is a lovely voice to listen to. But a lot of what they do, as you note on a site called Foxy.ai, this is capturing the voice and likeness of real influencers, right?
Yeah. absolutely.
And tell us a little bit about that. Are they selling themselves to this, or is it being scraped off the web?
In all those examples, they're influencers that have gone into the studios, recorded their voices, said what they can and can't do, set limitations often, and set characteristics that are like them. So the idea is that you could be a really big fan of an influencer, follow them along, see their story on social media, and then go chat, text, and also voice call with someone that sounds exactly like them. So it is much more personal than you might expect.
How much is my dating life costing me if I'm in this kind of relationship? I mean, does it all depend on what she likes or he likes, or how much money am I in for?
Well, it can cost you as much as your Netflix subscription. They're usually often monthly services that can be about $8 a month at the basic, but they can really rack up a huge amounts because you can end up buying gifts, or if you want not safe for work images, or if you want videos, or if you want to buy them a present, or if you want to create a whole world for them, you can. So there is no limit, basically. You can spend a huge amount of money. And one of the case studies I look at in the article is of a wife that found out her husband had spent $6,000 on jewelry and lingerie for this AI person that didn't exist while she sat there with nothing.
This is not, we can think, oh my God, these people are quote unquote pathetic. And yet there is an epidemic of loneliness, right? And this is how is this sort of answering that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge issue with loneliness around the world. In America, it's nearly 50% of people that are reported to have this loneliness. I mean, when you look at, there was a figure done in 2011 that said almost half of Americans reported having 3 or fewer friends, and that was 25% in the 1990s. So our close connections are really shrinking. And it makes sense when a lot more of us are working from home, when our whole lives are online on the internet, that people are finding different ways to connect. And AI is an easy, non-judgmental way to do it. There's also data to suggest that some people use these kind of AI sites helpfully as a way to come out of their social shell, to practice almost conversing, to talk about things they don't feel like they can, especially people who want to come out or be their true self and haven't done it publicly yet, can do it in a safe way with AI bots. So there are definitely people using it in a really positive, helpful way.
I mean, Flora, I'm sorry to say it. What about sex?
Yeah, well, people are definitely using AI in sexual ways. I mean, as soon as anything gets put on the internet, very quickly, the public find a way to make it sexual. And that happened pretty much immediately with AI. And people are having what they say are pretty intense sexual relationships, obviously not physically when they're an AI bot. Again, that brings it all back to what is and isn't okay if you're in a relationship, what is and isn't normal. But I think unhelpful words like normal are completely changing and keep on evolving.
So it's safe to say that there's going to be an entirely new sex industry spring up around AI within the next 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah, definitely. There are sex toys in development that are controlled by AI. There's dirty stories that you can read online written by AI. There's AI voiced pornography, erotic fiction, which is much more popular with women than men, the erotic fiction genre. So I think we're only scratching the surface of the way AI is going to change porn and sex. And I'm interested to see where it goes.
As we say in the American Midwest, Flora, Jesus, take the wheel. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Flora. Take care.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Michael, what kind of world are we living in?
Yeah, and yet it's not a surprise. I mean, you think about like when the video cassette recorder came in, how that changed the intimacy industry. And then you think about the smartphone, how that changed the quote unquote intimacy industry. So, wow, me speechless right now. That's me.
I love it. Very few things, Michael, that can do it to you, but it turns out the heady mix of AI and sexuality is just going to do it to both of us here. Okay, let's get back onto terra firma. Who should we bring on next?
Well, speaking of sex, we have a fascinating story of a whole different nature brought to us this week by John Arledge out of the UK about very British scandal.
John is here to talk us through the curious case of Carl Beech. He brought a wave of charges of sexual misconduct and abuse against very high-profile members of the British establishment. But then there was a twist. John is a reporter who covers business at the Times of London, and he is also a fellow of the Orwell Prize for Journalism. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
John, we last had you on here to talk about the post office scandal that's been plaguing the UK, and that was the subject of Mr. Bates in the post office, which was a hit on TV in the US as well as the UK. We're here to talk about a scandal of a much more sinister nature. This is one that was involving Carl Beech. So let's start off. Who was he?
Carl Beech was a nurse. That's all we can really say for sure about him. When he came along in 2014 and started making some insane, wild allegations about some of the most senior members of the British establishment. Essentially, he said that senior members of the Conservative Party were engaged in a VIP paedophile ring, and he and many others had been abused by these former MPs, including former Prime Minister Ted Heath, over a period of almost a decade, being driven around from paedophile sex party to paedophile sex party. His allegations were taken extremely seriously, and there was a very, very long investigation into them. But there's only one problem with the investigation and the story as a whole, is that apart from being a nurse, there's absolutely nothing that Carl Beech was saying that was actually true. He'd entirely made up these allegations, and yet they were taken extremely seriously by the police and many others. And in some ways, although the post office scandal affects more people and probably did more damage to a greater number of people, the depth of the damage of the Carl Beech scandal was much, much deeper. Some of these, they were all men, died before their names were cleared. It caused an enormous amount of pain and suffering for absolutely no reason at all. It was all made up, yet somehow it gained currency.
And why was his story just taken as gospel? Or were there any clues from the beginning that this might not be adding up?
There should have been clues from the beginning that his story didn't really stack up. It's almost beggars belief when you looked at some of the things he was talking about. He was talking about young men being killed at parties, young men being threatened with castration at parties, young men being killed in hit-and-run car accidents it was really, really wild stuff. And you're right to ask, why was it not investigated more closely? Why was he not scrutinized more closely? And to understand that, you need to understand the time that it was happening. It was happening a few years back, and it followed the case of Jimmy Savile. Now, Jimmy Savile, for those who don't know, was a very, very odd man. He had this sort of platinum blonde hair and used to smoke cigars and wear a string vest. He was deeply unpleasant to look at. And he turned out to be a deeply unpleasant man as well. He was a star of BBC TV and radio shows. He was one of the most well-known anchors of popular shows, and he abused that position to sexually abuse mostly young women. He disguised this by doing lots of good works for charities, and he got the OBE and various things. I had photographed with Margaret Thatcher, who was then Prime Minister, and Prince Charles, now King Charles. But behind this facade, there was an absolutely extraordinary 4 decades long period when he was a prolific sex abuser, and somehow he'd been missed. He hadn't been spotted. He hadn't been investigated. So there was a feeling in Britain that there was almost a crisis, if you like, around how we dealt with these kinds of stories. So when Carl Beech, using the pseudonym Nick, comes along and makes these wild allegations, rather than scrutinizing what he said, he was taken seriously. And there was a famous quote from one of the detectives investigating the case where the detective said, "We believe what Carl says," or "We believe what Nick says." Well, he shouldn't have done. And as it turned out in the subsequent investigation, pretty much everything Carl has said was wrong. And even worse than that, when the police began to investigate Carl more closely, they discovered that he had in his possession images of child abuse. He himself was an abuser, not the other way around. He was just making baseless accusations. And it's hard to imagine anything quite so venal, if you like, and quite so appalling, the way that it was allowed to develop without being shut down pretty quickly, because it just didn't stack up.
John, how long was this occupying the news cycle in the UK?
A few years. I mean, there were some MPs that jumped on the bandwagon. The people that should have known better were treating it with great seriousness because there was political capital being made out of it. So it was a several-year process before it actually got shut down. But the damage was done in that period to all sorts of people. There were former Prime Minister Ted Heath, I mentioned, but also a former Home Secretary under Margaret Thatcher, Leon Britton. There was a former Tory MP, Harvey Procter. There was the former head of the Armed Services, Lord Bramall. These were, if you imagine in an American context, if you imagine the most senior members of the Republican Party and in the military being accused of being a part of a VIP pedophile sex ring in DC, that's kind of the equivalent of it. And I guess it sort of falls a bit into the sort of Hillary pizza scale. It's just kind of, you look at it and you just think this simply cannot possibly be true, but it was taken seriously.
And some of the men who were accused of these horrific crimes didn't even live to see their names cleared, right? Can you tell us about some of those stories?
There was a couple of those men who were accused who died before their names were cleared. Their wives often survived them, but the damage was done to their reputation. They were cleared posthumously. There was some compensation paid, but that wasn't really the point. I mean, can you imagine a situation where you're an elderly man, you're in your 80s or 90s, and you're accused of the worst possible crimes imaginable? You know you didn't do it, but you die with this stain on your character, you think. Now, the stain is lifted later, but hey, what? You're dead. I mean, you died like fearing this was going to be your legacy. It's really hard to imagine anyone doing something so wicked, really, as this guy did. And he obviously was terribly smart in terms of telling these stories and getting people to believe him. But the kind of job of the police is to be, and the media too, I should say, is to be pretty skeptical. I mean, the BBC has a sort of dishonourable mention in this story that the BBC Newsnight programme did cotton on to what Jimmy Savile at least was doing, and some other characters in this accused of these kind of offences, and they weren't allowed to broadcast their allegations against Jimmy Savile. So it's a pretty sorry saga in the British establishment, and we seem to be quite good at these kind of scams. Sort of goes quite good for podcasts like this. I'm not entirely sure it's good for the United Kingdom, but there you go.
John, I mean, I think you rightly say he's far from being a victim of child abuse. He himself aided and abetted. The police eventually raided his home, found extremely graphic content on his computers. Number one, did they ever realize and find a motive from him for wanting to do this? And what happened to him?
He eventually was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison for a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. We don't really know why he did it. He was clearly a very, very troubled man in all sorts of ways. But we never really got to the idea of why, or the sense of what his motivation was for this. Could it have been attention-seeking? Possibly. Was he deluded? Certainly. Was he malicious and nefarious? Definitely. But as to why he would want to, I don't think there was a political motive. That's what was driving. I don't think he had any sort of, or became political. I think it falls into the category of one of those ones where, sadly, people do awful things and one never really knows why. And that's also one of the sadder things about it. I mean, why would somebody do that? It's an extraordinary thing to contemplate, far less actually do. And all the more remarkable that he should be taken seriously, yet he was. And I suspect all future inquiries, investigations into these kind of matters in the UK will certainly be treated seriously. But you have to sometimes look at the nature of the lurid allegations that were being made particularly about the murders, and wonder how on earth is it possible over a 10-year period young men can be killed and nobody's going to notice. There's going to be no evidence. This is just the word of one man. It's a really remarkable failure of policing, and also a failure of the media too, to really dig deeply into this guy. I really, really hope it never happens again, because it shouldn't happen once, let alone twice.
Well, John, it's a fascinating and also horribly sad story, but thank you so much for explaining it to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was great.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Michael, do you have anything at all you can recommend?
Well, I'd recommend that everyone go to London and see Ashley and David. I want to thank you again for a fantastic dinner party at your beautiful home, where we saw everyone from Ruthie Rogers and Josh to Jeremy King and Alex Shulman. Brooke and I had a fantastic time, so we want to thank you. So if Ashley one day opens her home to everyone, I highly suggest you book. You gave us a great visit, so we thank you very much for that.
Oh my God, too charming. Did you have fun? Did you see anything good? Did you eat at any good restaurants?
We had a best time, which is like I hadn't been to London in like 5-6 years, and Brooke and I had never been there together, so it was wonderful. But I encourage everyone to go. It's a wonderful time. Ruthie Rogers treated us to a magnificent, unforgettable evening at the River Cafe, and then we got to double date with you at the Arlington for a very fun evening. Now, on to things I can recommend. I want to point you all to the reissue of the Beatles' 1970 documentary, Let It Be. Last weekend, the director of it, Michael Lindsay Hogg, wrote a terrific story for us here at Airmail about his experience, and I encourage you all to read that and then watch it. This film is set in London also, and it's been out of circulation for decades, but Peter Jackson has restored it, and it captures the recording sessions of the band's final album of the same title. It was originally released mere weeks after the Beatles officially split. None of them attended its premiere in 1970, but you can watch it now. It's been out of circulation, I said, for many years, so it's a real treat to see it. It's riveting and it's brilliant, and it is on Disney Plus right now. And you, my dear, what can you recommend?
I think we need to talk a little bit more about Baby Reindeer. I'm sorry. Have you seen it all?
Baby Reindeer, which is like now the #1 show on Netflix in the world, and probably rightly so, because it is so, you got a better descriptor of this, but it sort of preys on your thought of like, oh, I'll be nice to someone, but then of course something goes horribly wrong, right? Isn't that the fear it plays on?
Okay, so Baby Reindeer is a new drama on Netflix. It was written by and directed and stars Richard Gadd, who's a Scottish writer and an actor and a comedian. And it's really based on his own experience, two of which are really notable. One is the first experience of being stalked, which is what Michael and I were sort of joking about earlier in the show. And then it also touches on this trauma in his past, a story of sexual assault that's incredibly disturbing, distressing. I think it's one of the best, most nuanced portrayals of grooming I've ever seen. Have you seen the 4th episode, Michael? This is sort of his flashback episode.
I have not seen it yet.
Well, watch it early in the morning, okay, if you want to sleep at night, because I think it's one of the finest pieces of writing, acting, directing. Bravery is such an overused word these days, but the bravery of Gadd to revisit this incredibly traumatic experience from his own past in this show. I mean, I found it completely riveting and heartbreaking and all the things. So really, really recommend Baby Reindeer. I know everyone's going to have a different thought on it, but it's one of those shows, Michael, that makes me think differently about not only what it takes to make great television, but also how very difficult it's got to be an artist and writer who's mining these experiences from their life in that way. It's all the great things of great television. Well, on that note, we wish you all a wonderful weekend. We hope it's sunny and warm wherever you are. Michael, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Gia Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe. Enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.